it was something that a huge, huge swath of the American population read. It was kind of like a grand hearth that people, gathered around in a way.
Welcome to Journalism History, a podcast that rips out the pages of your history books to re-examine the stories you thought you knew and the ones you were never told.
I'm Terry Finneman, and I research media coverage of women in politics.
And I'm Nick Hirshon, and I research the history of New York sports.
And I'm Ken Ward, and I research the journalism history of the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains. And together, we're professional media historians guiding you through our own drafts of history. Transcripts of the show are available online at journalism-history.org/podcast. We've done a lot of research on Life magazine. A lot. A quick search of our journals turns up dozens of articles focused squarely on that magazine and its contents, its operations, and its impact on American culture and journalism. And we should. I'm not saying we shouldn't. It was a major force. The question raised by today's guest is why we haven't given that same amount of attention to Life's rival, Look magazine. It ran during the same period, it lived just about as long, it sometimes even held the circulation lead, reaching as many as 35 million Americans with each issue. But it's far less frequently referenced in our literature, and when it is, it's rarely the focus. With me today is Andrew L. Yarrow, a former New York Times reporter, book author, and historian. In this episode, he fills us in on just what this magazine was all about as we discuss his new book, titled Look, How a Highly Influential Magazine Helped Define Mid-20th Century America. Andrew, welcome to the show. So, you write in the book that Look magazine slipped from the national memory despite it being a really major force in American culture. And so, in a minute, I want to get to the magazine and its contents. But first, how does that happen? Like, why isn't there more historical appreciation for this magazine?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ken. Look, which published for 35 years, by the late 1960s, before it folded in October of 1971, had a circulation of close to 8 million, which meant that about 30 to 35 million people read each issue. So it was a major, major magazine. It outsold Life. It was a huge, huge presence in American journalism and American culture, particularly in the 50s and 60s. But it really did disappear from view and from memory after it folded. And I think part of the problem was that unlike Life magazine, which is often and correctly seen as its competitor, the company that published Look, Kohl's Communication, did not do anything to sustain the magazine or its memory. I mean, the company basically went out of business, unlike Time Life, which, kept Life alive, even though Life folded less than a year after Look in 1972. And as you know, I mean, it's hard to go into a supermarket or a drugstore these days and not see one of the Life bookazines, whether it's on Mick Jagger or Queen Elizabeth, these sort of knockoff publications, basically of photos from Life. So, unlike Life, Look did not have vehicles to keep it alive. And, many of the forces that caused Look and Life after it to fold sort of overwhelmed the memory of Look. And, those forces included things like television, things like specialized magazines, whether Sports Illustrated or Psychology Today, which was actually edited by a former Look staffer. I mean, they really took over in the 1970s. And, and photojournalism also did not, there weren't really great vehicles in print media for continuing photojournalism. So, to me, as an author and aficionado of Look, it's very sad that Look disappeared. from memory, and it hasn't been digitized, unlike many other publications, including Life. So it's very hard, to really find Look. I mean, you can only find hard copies in some major libraries, like the Library of Congress, where I did much of my research,
Hmm.
or old flea markets or things like eBay, that flea markets that may have old issues. So
So, so if someone were to come across one of these issues of this magazine, what exactly did they look like? What generally speaking was this magazine about? What was it that it aimed to do?
sure, sure. Well, Look was a large format magazine. I believe, gosh, was it 11 by 14 or 10 something by 14? It was a biweekly, so it published every other week, unlike Life, which published weekly. And it was a general interest magazine, so it tried to cover everything. Though being a biweekly, it did feature stories. It didn't try to do news stories like Life did, or like the news magazines, Time or Newsweek or US News. So it did long feature stories, often long feature stories. There were some short ones as well, but that combined the use of photographs and text, and it and many areas did very pioneering journalism, particularly in its coverage of civil rights and racial justice and racial tension issues, but also in foreign policy, its coverage of the Cold War, its coverage of social movements like the women's movement, second wave feminism in the 60s and early 70s, the youth movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the counterculture. But it also did, soft and fluffy features about a lot of features on Hollywood stars. And, it did profiles of politicians, and it did sports stories. For example, Jim Bouton's Ball Four began as an article in Look. It serialized books like William Manchester's Death of a President was serialized in 4 issues at 80,000 words. And those issues were among the best selling ones of in Look's history. Look claimed that about 70 million Americans in a population of maybe 200 million read some of that series. So Look covered a little bit of everything and had wonderful photographers and many talented and, in some cases, kind of quirky writers. And many of the writers and editors of Look, after it folded, went on to other careers in journalism. And Look also published essays by prominent Americans, ranging from William F. Buckley Jr. to Ernest Hemingway to Eleanor Roosevelt. It published essays by all of the Kennedys, by Martin Luther King, a piece that was published that was set for publication in April of 1968. And of course, King was assassinated in early April of 68. And that piece came out, it hit the newsstands, sadly, just after his assassination. So, Look was really, a look at America and the world in the 1950s and 60s, and before that too, in the 40s and into the very early 70s, and covered other popular culture too, rock musicians, you name it, really.
Well, so you mentioned those early years. So I always like a publication that comes from a part of the country that I can recognize as someone living in Kansas. And this story begins, if I'm not mistaken, in Iowa. So can you help us understand how did this magazine get started? What was its early content like?
Yeah, absolutely. It was started by a man named Gardner Coles. He went by Mike, so Mike Coles, who was his father had owned or owned the Des Moines Register, and Mike Coles had become sort of inherited the Des Moines Register and became the publisher of the Register in his 20s and in the late 1920s. And Mike Coles thought of Look initially as being a spin-off from a Sunday supplement to the Des Moines Register. And he was influenced by a couple of things. There really were not picture magazines or picture publications in America before Life and Look. And, he consulted with Henry Luce, who was thinking of developing Life at the same time in the mid 1930s. They initially didn't think that they would be competitive, though of course they became big competitors. But a lot of the impetus came from European magazines, German and French magazines that had started to do kind of photojournalism, photo magazines in the after World War I in the 1920s. And another interesting tidbit about the origins of Look, George Gallup had been a PhD student at the University of Iowa, and Mike Coles, the publisher, knew or discovered Gallup. And actually, Gallup's early polling kind of found, or early survey research found that stories told with pictures and text could incredibly appeal to readers in a way that a lot of journalism wasn't doing. So Gallup became, after Look debuted in January of 1937, Gallup kind of remained sort of on retainer with Look for many years, did some of his earliest polling for Look into the 1940s. But Look began in January of 37, and its beginning was perhaps not, it was a very rocky beginning. The first issue had sort of a terrible problem. The back cover of the issue had an image that some readers discovered if one folded the picture. I mean, this may sound ridiculous. It looked like a kind of pornographic image. And so, there was a lot of outrage, and people thought, oh, this is a terrible magazine. It should fold. It should end. And, many of the early issues had rather sensational and kind of ridiculous covers, even though there was sometimes interesting content. Of course, this was in the run-up to World War II, so there were stories on Hitler and fascism, but the covers would have these awful images of, damsels in distress with, like a dragon or a monster or something, really ridiculous things. And but within a few years, it's kind of crazy. Within a few years, Look cleaned up its act and got the first of a number of very good art directors, and became by about 1940, when it moved from Des Moines to New York City, became a much more serious magazine, and that development continued to the point by the end of World War II, by the late 40s, Look became the kind of recognizable magazine that it was for the rest of its history. It would do no more of the sort of silly kind of offensive covers. It did thoughtful stories. It still might have, and often did have, for better or worse, attractive actresses or other people, on the celebrities on the cover. But, it would also do powerful stories, as I mentioned, on, everything from civil rights to birth control to, issues in American politics, to, as wonderful, wonderful coverage of the Cold War. It was really the first major magazine major publication to get a writer and photographer into communist China in the mid-50s. For example, it did some very powerful stories. It twice sent journalists along the whole length of the Iron Curtain, from Southern Europe up through beyond the Arctic Circle in Finland, and showed really showed the tensions in the Cold War in a very personal sense, and that was something about Look too that differentiated it from Life and from the news magazines. It tried to humanize many issues, whether they were foreign policy issues or issues of racism or poverty in America. It did many stories on poverty and economic problems in America, but would often do this by telling the stories of a family or individuals, and what their lives were.
Well, so you mentioned that in the book, right? I think the words, I can't remember if they were yours or someone else's, but you referred to Look as being kind of a poor man's version of Life. Do you think this was an intentional differentiation from Life? Were they doing this competitively? What led them to that style of coverage?
Well, I mean, the poor man's version, I think I put in quotes because in many ways, Look was a more thoughtful magazine than Life. And I know, this is not a widespread view, but Look, as one writer told me, and I interviewed many of the surviving writers and editors and photographers for Look, and I'm actually working on a documentary film now about Look magazine, interviewing many of these writers and editors. As one told me, Look's stories ranged from the pits of bad taste to the visionary, and it's more powerful stories. Were really much more thoughtful than the kinds of pieces one found in Life or the news magazines. Life, of course, Time Inc. publications were heavily edited. And there was sort of one voice in Life and in Time and the news magazines, but then whereas Look really gave its writers a lot of leeway, and one could hear a writer's voice, whether it was a figure like a writer like Ernest Dunbar, who was one of the first African American journalists on staff of a major U.S. publication in the 1950s, writing about racial injustice, or whether it was George Leonard, one of really the more visionary writers for Look, writing about the new psychologies or psychological movements, humanistic psychology, the human potential movement. And George Leonard, for example, kind of helped popularize Esalen, the Big Sur Retreat Center, that after Look folded, Leonard went on to become a leader of Esalen. So, I mean, there was a lot to in terms of the voices of Look journalists that really made it a more thoughtful magazine than Life. So I would push back at the idea that it was a poor man's version of Life.
Sure. One idea that struck me as particularly important, and you return to it repeatedly in the book, is that this idea of the post-war consensus, and that Look magazine played a really strong role in cultivating that post-war consensus. So can you help us understand just briefly what that consensus was, and explain how it was that this magazine played such a powerful role in establishing that in the United States?
Sure. Well, I mean, that consensus, which, seems very far away in our politics today,
Right.
was really that most Democrats and Republicans from the end of World War II up till the end of the 60s, really, believed that, the role of government, of public policy, of politicians in America was one to kind of advance the prosperity and rights of all Americans, to improve the well-being of all Americans. And, if whatever kind of economic or social policies it took, whether that meant expanding Social Security, which was done under Republican as well as Democratic administrations, Eisenhower and Nixon, as well as Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson, or advancing civil rights. I mean, the first civil rights bill was in 1957 under Eisenhower, when Lyndon Johnson was majority leader, to the better known and more historic 64 Civil Rights and 65 Voting Rights Acts under Lyndon Johnson, which, won bipartisan support, or the creation of programs like Medicare and Medicaid under Johnson. So, and housing policy, the GI Bill, to, again, things to advance all Americans' prosperity at home, but overseas to fight communism, for America to stand tall as a beacon of freedom in the world in fighting communism, for better or worse. I mean, of course, that got us in a lot of trouble in Vietnam and elsewhere. But there was broadly these parameters of policy that most Democrats and Republicans agreed on. And Look really helped foster this. Gardner Coles, Mike Coles, the publisher, was a liberal Republican, even though, by today's standards, he would be considered, a pretty liberal Democrat, to be honest. But, he supported civil rights. He supported big internationalists. When it's maybe hard to remember or hard to think of today that the U.S. was not only the principal founder of the UN, but a big supporter of the United Nations and multilateral institutions, which Coles and Look's longtime top editor, Dan Mish, supported, believed that America had a role in advancing freedom and prosperity throughout the world. So, Look did thoughtful coverage from Africa to India, all over the world. And kind of a final piece of that, which I talk about in my book, is that a phrase that I really like that Mike Coles used. He said, Look's philosophy is tough-minded optimism. And as he wrote, and I'll read just a sentence here, we believe that the problems confronting our civilization, peace, poverty, population, and pollution, just to name a few, can and will be solved, but only if more people understand what's really going on around them and why. And I think, that's a great kind of description of what Look tried to do and Look's philosophy. It didn't sugarcoat problems. It highlighted problems, but there was an optimism that they could be solved. And that was very much in keeping with the beliefs of political leaders of both parties during this 2.5 decade period from the end of World War II through the 1960s.
Yeah, sure. So we're starting to run short on time, but I wanted to ask you briefly. I couldn't pass this up. In the opening pages of this book, you actually claim that this magazine may have had as big an impact on American culture in its era as Facebook has in the 21st century. Can that be true? Like, what is it that made it so impactful?
Well, I mean, one thing was the sheer scope of its circulation, of its reach. As I say, it, as well as Life, reached about as many as 35 million Americans with each issue. And this was at a time, I mean, in the 1950s, America had about 175 million people. By the 1960s, 220 million people. And of course, today America is much, much larger. We're a country of 330 million people. No media have that kind of reach. I mean, you think of, Fox News or CNN reaching, 3, 4 million people at most. But, in terms of, I mean, the comparison to Facebook, and in some ways, given Facebook's many problems, I uh, might pull back from that comparison a little bit. But I think the magazine, it was something that was found on coffee tables of people of all social classes, from executives to working people. You'd find it influenced policy in Washington. You could find it in the proverbial barber shop or beauty shops of America. So, what I really meant by that comparison was that, it was something that a huge, huge swath of the American population read. It was kind of like a grand hearth that people, gathered around in a way. And, a phrase that I also mention in my book that former President Obama used, he's talked about how we've lost the ability to have a common national conversation, which I think is very true today. But I think Look Look and Life too helped facilitate that, and the three networks, simply by the fact that people of all sorts of different backgrounds and different political beliefs all read Look or Life, or watched Walter Cronkite, and we don't have that today. We don't have that shared information, that shared stories, shared ideas. A medium like Look provided.
Sure. Well, we only have time for one last question, but I want to make sure we get it in because it's one that we ask all of our guests. So, Andrew, in your opinion, why does journalism history matter?
Well, gosh, that's a great and huge question. I mean, as a journalist, as somebody who's been a reporter for the New York Times, who's been a freelance journalist, who's taught journalism, I obviously believe that journalism and media and getting information on the issues and problems and successes of our country and world are extremely important, and getting multiple perspectives and multiple ideas, which is obviously a problem in much journalism today, are extremely important. And that's why looking at media that did this successfully in the past or did this differently, whether it's a publication like Look, or whether it's, Fortune in the 1950s, or, CBS News with Edward R. Murrow or Cronkite. Even looking at how different publications or different media kind of successfully brought awareness of problems and needs in the world to the attention of the American people or people around the world in ways that led to better understanding of other people, and in many cases to policy changes for the better in society. I think it's very important, and to see the successes of media in the past as well as the failures. I think can inform better journalism, better information today.
Absolutely. Well, Andrew, that's all the time that we have for this episode, but I want to thank you for being on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, thanks, Ken. This was great. I appreciate it too.
Well, that's it for this episode. Again, the book is Look, How a Highly Influential Magazine Helped Define Mid-20th Century America. Thank you for tuning in, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast. You can also follow us on Twitter at JHistoryJournal. That's all one word. Until next time, I'm your host, Ken Ward, signing off with the words of Edward R. Murrow. Good night and good luck.